It takes courage to take that step solely because of the stigma our society has put on mental health medications. If we were experiencing a physical health issue, we wouldn't be nearly as hesitant in exploring medications that help a concern we're having. We need to adopt a more open and understanding approach to individuals with mental health disorders, as they are more than just their signs and symptoms, and they deserve help just as much as anyone else.
Welcome to Beyond the Threshold, a podcast where we discuss the various ways housing, mental health, and substance use disorders collide. Brought to you by Threshold's Homes and Supports in Kitchener, Ontario. This is part 2 of our series on stigma, language, and the need for change. I'm your host, Ian, and joining me today are my co-hosts, Ali and Farron.
We're excited to have you back for part 2. My name is Ali, and I'm a social worker with the Assertive Community Treatment Team, and I have our student here, Farron.
Hey everyone, happy to be back again.
And we're going to be chatting about the reality of stigma today and its effects on individuals' lives and our system as a whole. We're going to jump right back into debunking more myths. Now on to our next myth. Medications, just like people, differ from person to person. We've heard stories about people with depression trying 3 to 4 different SSRI medications in order to finally see benefits, while others feel benefits on their first try. This is because when a psychiatrist or a doctor is prescribing, a lot of it is a guess. This isn't to say that it's because they don't know what they're doing, but rather, like I said, each person responds so differently to medications that it would be impossible to know how someone would respond to a medication without that trial and error period. I've heard many clients and individuals in the community assume that people should be cured or doing better because they're on medications. This simply is not true for a variety of reasons. Not only can medications not work for every person, but they can also cause negative side effects that can also be attributed to why certain symptoms aren't going away. Not only that, but medications are also not a replacement for skills we have to develop as humans. For example, antidepressants alone aren't going to make someone start cooking more than they did before, but they may provide a boost to help make cooking seem less overwhelming. That person, on their own, still has to develop these skills independently with the addition of their medication. They may help make it easier to consider cooking, but actually making the meal and having food preparation skills are still something someone would have to develop because pills are not skills. While we know that pills can help certain symptoms improve, this does not negate the need to develop skills to better meet our own needs.
Yeah, that's super true, Ali. Another myth that we often hear is that cannabis isn't addictive. While cannabis is a common and legal substance in Canada, despite being legal, it can still be addictive. Roughly 11% of people who use cannabis can become dependent on it. In the same way we discussed earlier that not everyone will develop a substance dependence on opioids, not everyone will develop a dependence on cannabis. But it is still very possible.
Wow, that's a really good one that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. Many people also believe that mental illness is just an excuse for poor behavior. We hear it in the media regularly that those who are mentally ill are quote-unquote lazy, manipulative, or violent depending on their diagnosis. This is inherently not true. While some of these behaviors can exist within certain mental illnesses as a part of their symptoms, it's incredibly unfair for us to label people as this because of their mental health. Mental illness is an illness. Just like any other physical illness, if you have a cold or have to take the day off to rest, nobody is going to question it. But when it comes to mental health, we often can be too quick to jump to judgments that write off the person as being lazy when in fact they really are struggling. Just because we cannot see that someone is struggling doesn't mean it's not there. We wouldn't judge someone living with diabetes for taking insulin or medication that helps them get through the day, but for some reason, mental health medications have stigma attached to them that implies we are not able to quote-unquote manage on our own. In reality, every single one of us has bodies and brains that work differently, that send different messages to our synapses, and that have different chemical combinations that make us who we are. For someone to need a boost to their health through medication because of an imbalance beyond their control, this should be rewarded as opposed to being looked down upon. They are actually taking care of themselves, so this definitely needs to be rewarded. It takes courage to take that step solely because of the stigma our society has put on mental health medications. If we were experiencing a physical health issue, we wouldn't be nearly as hesitant in exploring medications that help a concern we're having. We need to adopt a more open and understanding approach to individuals with mental health disorders, as they are more than just their signs and symptoms, and they deserve help just as much as anyone else. Similarly, when we rush to label someone as manipulative or violent due to their mental illness, we are further adding to the stigma. Often these types of behaviors emerge due to coping skills individuals have learned to get their needs met, and they often do not know any other way to meet that need, so their natural reaction is to use these default techniques. Many individuals also grow up in families that haven't taught them coping strategies, or the only ones that they have been taught are maladaptive, like coping with substances or anger. This shows how important working through our own issues are, because without even noticing, many aspects of our coping, or lack thereof, are passed down through generations and often become our default, which makes it that much harder to challenge them or insert more appropriate coping strategies. When you're on the receiving end of maladaptive coping strategies that negatively impact you, it's also okay for us to set boundaries in these scenarios, but it does not mean that we should look down on people or refuse to support them because of this. There are just some of their symptoms and ultimately do not and should not define the person as a whole. We need to remember that it is the disorder, not the person behind these behaviors. No one chooses to experience mental illness. Not only that, but 50% of people will experience mental health challenges in their life. So it is very possible that even if you are doing okay right now, it may not be like that forever. And in the same breath, if you are struggling right now, it may not be like that forever either. By developing a better awareness of our assumed beliefs of a person, we can take a step back and properly view them as an individual struggling with their mental health who deserves to be heard and supported, just like anyone else despite their diagnosis and symptoms.
That's a really good point, Allie. I know I can speak for many people in the mental health field, because when we tell people our career paths to people that are not in this field, we often hear, "Wow, good for you, that must be hard," or "I could never do that," or any other variation of something like that. This response implies that not only is my job hard because they wouldn't do it, but further reinforces that othering concept we spoke about earlier. It implies that clients must be challenging, and as a result are also challenges to our community. This becomes synonymous with those living with mental health challenges, those living with a substance use disorder, or those experiencing homelessness, as they are typically who is being referenced. This forces everyone into one box, making it appear that all are an issue, when in reality, it is far and few between. Not to mention that this perspective fails to have compassion, and to see each person as their own person. Are the individuals we work with a challenge, or are they experiencing challenges as a result of the broken system? Are these individuals hard to work with, or have they been failed by the system so much that they don't trust in it anymore? Are you really unable to do this work, or have you simply just not met someone we work with one-to-one so that your perspective can shift? I bet if you met a handful of people, your perspective might shift, as you'll see the humanness, the compassion, and the gratitude mental health workers get to see every single day.
That's a great point. People stay in the field for a reason, so it's definitely worth seeing why. While we know that most of the drug poisonings that happen in our community are from opiates, tranquilizers, and other dangerous additives, there also seems to be a myth out there that those who use stimulants are safe because you can't experience a drug poisoning while using stimulants. This is just simply not true. While naloxone exists to specifically help with reversing the side effects of opiate-related drug poisonings because of the sedating effects of opiates, stimulants have the opposite effect. They can increase your heart rate so much that someone is at risk of having a heart attack, chest pain, irregular or stopped heartbeats, difficulty breathing, seizures, strokes, and more. Individuals can also have predispositions that also make them more vulnerable to experiencing a drug poisoning when using stimulants. It is also important to remember that the many substances in our community are laced with a variety of different substances and additives. Common additives or fillers we see in the substances to help make the product stretch further are sugar, lidocaine, laundry detergent, baking soda, Epsom salts, talcum powder, cornstarch, flour, and more. It's also possible for someone who used crystal meth to experience a drug poisoning from an opiate because it was laced, which means that naloxone is still a good idea even if they reported just using crystal meth. Administering naloxone with someone who you're unsure has consumed an opiate will not harm them in any way, so it's the safest option alongside calling 911.
Absolutely. It's definitely really important to keep naloxone on us because you never know when you may need it. Another myth that we see is that depending on the strength of the fentanyl, it can be naloxone resistant. Well, naloxone does bind to the opioid receptors and blocks the effect of the opioids. Not only is it a temporary solution, but they should still seek medical help, as many people can re-enter back into the drug poisoning state once the naloxone wears off. It also can take multiple doses of naloxone to take someone out of a drug poisoning. That does not mean it's naloxone resistant, but rather the opioid was consumed in high amounts that it does take more naloxone and time to come out of their system, as well as their personal response to the opiate itself. If someone is taking a little bit to respond to the naloxone, wait 2 to 3 minutes between doses. Following the next dose, wait another 2 to 3 minutes before administering another to give their brain time to respond to the naloxone. Continue to administer these doses until EMS arrives. If they don't wake up, it's not that the opiate was naloxone resistant, but rather that the person may have gone without oxygen for too long, unfortunately. Either way, it is always better to be safe than sorry with naloxone, as using it will not cause any harm to an individual. We highly recommend you try your best to keep a naloxone kit nearby or on your person at all times, as you never know when you may need it. You can pick up a naloxone kit from literally any of your local pharmacies with no questions asked. We do it all the time.
That is definitely scary and a good reason to always carry naloxone on you, like Farron said. Another common myth is that services like consumption and treatment services, safer supply services, harm reduction approaches, and more are condoning and enabling further substance use. The reality is that people are going to use substances either way if these services and approaches didn't exist. I mean, we all remember prohibition, right? Due to individuals doing it anyways, there is a much higher risk for infection, drug poisonings, and fatalities when we don't have the supports and approaches in place to save lives and help individuals do what they're going to do in safer manners. Not only that, but not providing these services can lead to a further burden on our hospital systems, which, as we know, are already dealing with long times to wait there. Providing safer alternatives in our community saves our system money in the end due to not having to support them further in our hospitals or our prison system.
That's a great point. If they're going to do it anyways, we might as well support them to do it in a safer, less risky way. Another common myth about mental health, and specifically eating disorders, is how often the media seems to present eating disorders only with women, and carries this idea that everyone with an eating disorder is underweight. In reality, less than 6% of people with eating disorders are medically diagnosed as underweight. Eating disorders are problems that affect a person's eating behaviors, as well as their attitudes and feelings about food. Note that the definition doesn't mention anything in relation to what or how our bodies look when living with an eating disorder. Myths that stereotype like this only lead to further misconceptions around mental health. It's no wonder we have to work so hard to change the narrative when our media impacts our perspective so easily.
That's a really good point, Farron. Another myth that comes to mind around mental health is that mental illness is a life sentence. Too often, individuals will view mental illness as something that is permanent and undefeatable. The reality is that mental illnesses are treatable, and it is entirely possible to recover and even thrive following a mental illness diagnosis. Recovery does not just include the complete resolution of a mental health problem, but also includes having a renewed ability to better cope and develop resilience and control over one's life. Even with conditions such as bipolar, schizophrenia, or others that are most often requiring lifelong treatment, an individual can experience a high-quality life through symptom management via medications, therapy, adopting better coping skills, and more. People ultimately can and do recover from mental illnesses. Just because somebody has a diagnosis does not mean it will last forever or condemns them to a life of misery. Thanks to the numerous treatments, services, and supports that are now out there for mental health, individuals have the ability to help themselves get better and go on to lead quality lives. Today, many people experiencing mental illnesses lead very productive and engaging lives as well, despite their diagnosis. In fact, more than 1 in 5 individuals live with mental illnesses today. That's over 20% of our population currently experiencing a mental health diagnosis, and then at least half of individuals will experience one throughout their lives, like we said earlier. I've had clients mention how much they love their schizophrenia or that they appreciate their anxiety because they know they wouldn't be as compassionate if they didn't have it. Mental illness ultimately is not a be-all, end-all situation. Hope and recovery is more than possible.
I think that's a really great point, Allie. A lot of times people who are diagnosed with mental illness feel hopeless because they feel like it truly is a life sentence that they cannot get out of. This simply is not true. We know recovery is possible, and that living with a mental illness does not mean you cannot have a quality life where you thrive. You wouldn't believe how many people you run into daily that are actively living with mental illness. This ties into another large myth that we often hear about mental illness that is particularly harmful. This is that mental illness is not a real illness. While we have come a long way in terms of developing better awareness for mental health, many individuals out there still believe that it's not a real health problem. The truth is that mental illnesses are real health problems with effective treatments. They are not just the regular ups and downs of life, and rather are chemical imbalances and changes that have occurred within the brain due to a variety of factors. Just because we can't physically see mental illnesses does not mean that they don't exist. When somebody breaks a bone, we don't tell them to just get over it or diminish their experiences, nor do we blame them if they need a cast or other extra help in their daily life while they recover. Instead, we encourage them to seek treatment and get the rest they need, willingly offering support in any way we can. The same should ultimately be true for mental illnesses as well.
You're totally right, Farron. Another common thing we hear regularly is that people don't need therapy or that it's useless to talk to people about our problems. I've also heard people say that they have friends who can be their therapist, and I really want to clarify that even if your friend is a registered therapist, it should still never be their responsibility to be your therapist. Not only will that lead to resentment and unrealistic expectations as a friend, but you also won't get the same kind of support you'd get from actual therapy. Your friends are a good support, but they're also likely going to be on your side in situations where a therapist might be able to help you see objectively how a situation actually played out. Therapists can challenge you in ways that your friends may not feel comfortable doing, or provide realistic, evidence-based practices that help you shift some of your unhealthy thinking patterns. Outside of that, many people think that those who go to therapy have quote-unquote something wrong with them, but that's not it at all. In reality, no human on this earth is so perfect that they don't have a single thing to work on. And ask yourself if you can think how much you've told yourself you have to work on XYZ, but never actually got around to it. A therapist can also help individuals be held accountable for their goals. Lastly, there are many studies that can confirm that harboring emotional pain can actually lead to long-term chronic physical health conditions. Our body is unable to determine the difference between emotional and physical threats, so our immune system fights back regardless. This often leads to many autoimmune diseases over years of suppressing emotions. Multiple sclerosis, Alzheimer's, rheumatoid arthritis, Crohn's disease, and more are common examples of diseases that have been linked to emotional suppression. A really good book that explains this more thoroughly is When the Body Says No by Dr. Gabor Mate, as it helps to understand the link between stress and physical health, as well as how to promote healing in many of these areas.
Good call, Allie. I love that book. There are also some normalized terms in society that are contributing to the stigma. Some common terms our society uses to describe people are quote-unquote addict, junkie, alcoholic, drunk, former addict, and more. It's important that instead of these terms, we use what's called person-first language. These slight changes may feel small, but in reality, they're changing it to look like the person has a problem, rather than the person being the problem. Some words we can use instead would be a person with a substance use disorder, a client, patient, a person in active use, a person in recovery, and so on. Substance abuse is also a term that is associated with negative judgments and punishment. As we know abuse to be a negative term, we shouldn't be associating substance use in the same breath. Instead, calling it substance use is much less harsh. If it is related to prescription medications, instead of saying substance abuse, we could use the term substance misuse.
Yeah, we definitely don't want to be aligning the word abuse with a medical disorder that's beyond an individual's control. Thanks for clarifying that, Farron. It's also important to be aware of labeling someone as clean, their needles and pipes as clean, or labeling their toxicology results as clean, as it's stigmatizing, because the other side of it is if they're not clean, this implies they must be dirty. Instead of saying someone has been clean, we could say that someone is in recovery or abstinent. Instead of labeling harm reduction supplies as clean, we could call them unused. Instead of labeling their toxicology results as clean or dirty, we can label it as testing negative or positive. And setting an example with our own language, we are not only encouraging less negative and punitive views, but we're showing that there are other ways of wording these things that don't further contribute to stigma. One of the most common ways to reduce the stigma is simply being mindful of the language we use. Looking at individuals with compassion and understanding that they are deserving of care and respect, rather than looking at their oppression as their identity, is important.
You're so right, Allie. The language we use is so critical and has the potential to be either harmful or really helpful. This makes me think about the stigma that also exists around mental health today and how we can work towards decreasing it in our daily lives. One of the core ways we can do this is also by shifting our language choices. Often when it comes to mental health diagnoses, we place these labels on the person and view them as their illness, rather than the person that they are. For example, a lot of the time we will refer to a person as bipolar, schizophrenic, or borderline. Instead of identifying the person by their diagnoses like this, we can change our language to a person with bipolar disorder or a person experiencing schizophrenia. By using this person-first language, we showcase respect for the individual as a person, rather than reducing them to the label that is their mental health diagnosis. Furthermore, there is a need for us to be careful about the words we use in our daily life. Words such as quote-unquote crazy, psychotic, or insane can be incredibly dangerous out of context. These words can be really sensitive and unhurtful, labeling a person as something they are not due to symptoms they may be experiencing, or mislabeling someone in our lives as these to describe their behavior when they aren't actually experiencing psychosis. We need to be mindful of the word choices we are making because they may be unintentionally causing harm or further isolating an individual or reinforcing this narrative that people who live with a mental health diagnosis are quote-unquote crazy. Another core language shift we should be making related to mental health is the words we use around suicide specifically. Rather than referring to someone as having committed suicide or being successful in doing so, we should replace these words by saying they died or lost their life by suicide. This takes away the stigmatizing blame and shame that exists around suicide and views the person as having died due to mental illness rather than of their own fault. Similarly, when referring to someone who has attempted suicide, we should not use words such as unsuccessful or failed suicide, but rather describe it as they survived an attempt or lived through it. This once again removes the blame from the person and reframes dying by suicide as something tragic, rather than achievement or something positive. It also validates the person's experience and recognizes the strength it must have taken for the person to have survived this.
That's so true. We often don't realize how much of a difference little changes that we make to the way that we go about our lives and speak on certain topics can make. Stigma is so incredibly harmful to people, and developing an awareness of its presence through listening to podcasts such as this one and further educating yourself is the first step in battling it. It's also so important to educate your friends and family. Take the time to pass on facts and challenge stereotypes that are inaccurate and contribute to further stigma when you hear them. Begin to implement changes into your own life and advocate for the removal of stigma in our society through simply speaking about it, changing your language, and viewing people just as people. We all deserve to be heard and supported no matter our circumstances. It's also important to remember that mental health and substance use disorders are medical conditions, not choices that make people undeserving of help. Lastly, we always need to self-reflect and be aware of our own attitudes and behaviors because they may be contributing to the stigma more than we even realize. We have to work together to fight the stigma that exists around those experiencing homelessness, substance use, and mental health challenges, and advocate for the creation of a stigma-free world where individuals can feel supported and understood.
Wow. I think on that note, I can say you've both provided me and our listeners some great food for thought over the last 2 episodes. And also, thanks, Sally and Farron, for your amazing insights on stigma and how our use of language impacts those living with mental health and substance use.
Thanks so much for having us. I'm grateful to be a part of the conversation.
Definitely so happy to have been here.
If you enjoyed this episode of BTT, please like and subscribe, and don't be afraid to share with friends and family. For more information on BTT and our sponsor, Thresholds Homes and Sports, you can find us on Spotify and YouTube. You can also check us out on our website, thresholdsports.ca. Follow us on Instagram at Threshold Sports, on X at Welcome to THS, and find us on Facebook at Thresholds Homes and Sports Inc. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time, Beyond the Threshold.